Hello, home bakers. Welcome back to another episode of my Back to Baking Basics series, a series where you learn about the fundamentals of baking that take you from guesswork to making amazing cakes every time. If you've missed any of the earlier episodes, you can catch up by looking into the description section and watching all the videos in the playlist. This episode is all about the ingredients. These are the stuff you whip up together to create the perfect batter, which then bakes into the perfect cake. Like with anything, you need to have a good understanding of the roles that your cake ingredients play so that you know how to use them, how to get the best of them, how to mix them up together to make your yummy cake. I don't know about you, but when I first started baking, I often used to wonder why certain ingredients were in some recipes and not in others. And then sometimes I used to wonder, well, if the recipe asks me to use this particular ingredient, if I don't have it, can I substitute? Will that work out well? These are all the questions that you may have as a cake beginner. Watch this video right to the end and you'll have all the answers. Honestly, this video is going to really transform your understanding of baking. We're going to be talking about different cake ingredients from the most obvious like flour right up to things like salt. Oh, I don't think I have salt here, but we're going to be talking about salt and everything in between. Let's dive in. Let's start with the backbone of our cakes, flour. Flour is a pretty important ingredient when it comes to cake making. It helps to form the structure of our cakes. Flour usually refers to flour that is gotten from the wheat grain. There are different other types of flours available, and these are commonly used in baking. But the most common one when you talk about flour is made from wheat. So how does flour give your cake structure? Flour has a protein molecule called gluten. When gluten is exposed to moisture, it starts to form interconnected bonds which give your cake its structure. When it comes to flour, there isn't just one type of flour. Actually, there are many different types of flour. The most common flours that you will use when you're making cakes is all-purpose flour, self-raising flour, and cake flour. I'm going to tell you about the difference between these three common flours so you'll never be confused again. So all-purpose flour is basically flour that has been milled, plain and simple. And it's perhaps the most common type of flour that you will use in your baking. So every baker all around the world has a bag or a jar of all-purpose flour because you use it all the time. And the self-raising flour, I personally like to use self-raising flour. For recipes like the traditional Victorian sponge cake, it calls for self-raising flour. Self-raising flour is a combination of plain flour which has added rising agent and sometimes salt added to it. The advantage of self-raising flour, it contains everything that you need. So you can make a cake using self-raising flour without needing to add any additional leavening agent like your baking powder or bicarbonate of soda. That's because it's already got your rising agents inside, so it's kind of self-sufficient. So self-raising flour is a great flour to use in some of your cake recipes. Now, one common question people ask, or I know I did when I first started baking, is can I substitute plain flour with self-raising flour? Yes, to a certain extent. If you are going to substitute, you need to be mindful that one has raisin agents in it and the other doesn't. So you have to compensate. So for example, if a recipe asks you to use plain flour and you've only got self-raising flour, can you use that instead? You could, but then you'll have to work out how to take out the raisin agent that is in the original recipe. Because if you're using plain flour, your recipe will ask you to use leavening agents. And if you use self-raising flour instead, you need to take that raising agent out. Sometimes that swap may not be like for like, so your cakes may not really turn out perfect the way that you really want it, or the way that the recipe intended it to be if you followed and used the right ingredients. On the flip side, if the recipe asks you for self-raising flour and you're using plain flour, then you've got to add some additional rising agents. So you can see that yes, you can swap, but actually the swap is not like for like, and it's not as straightforward. So probably not the best idea to swap. Try and use, if the recipe says use plain flour, try and use plain flour. If the recipe says use self-raising flour, use self-raising flour. The third flour that you will often see in cake recipes is cake flour. So cake flour is a wheat flour that has been very finely milled, so it's very fine in consistency. And it's also had some additional treatment to really make the grains nice, soft, and very fine. And that translates to a cake that is really soft and fluffy. There is a way that you can make your own cake flour at home if you don't have cake flour. To substitute cake flour, measure out 1 cup of all-purpose plain flour, then take 2 tablespoons out of it and replace it with cornstarch. Mix it all together so it's nicely combined, and then you need to sieve that flour at least twice. And that's a DIY cake flour that would work quite well. So that's our first super ingredient. Before I go on, can I tell you about something exciting that is happening with my DrMummyCakes brand? I'm in the process of creating something new that is really going to help baking beginners just like you to learn how to make cakes the easy, simpler, straightforward way. Now, no, it's not just a course. No, it's more than that. It's something that is pretty amazing, if I say so. So if you want to be part of this, then look in the description section, or when you watch the video to the end, you'll find the link. Go and sign up to the waiting list so that you can be involved with this super amazing project right from the start. And next, we're going to talk about sugar. Now, whenever people think about sugar in cakes, they think sugar makes cake sweet. Yes, it does, but it does so much more than that. Like literally, I think if you didn't have a good knowledge of baking, you might be surprised to learn the many roles that sugar plays in cakes. So, what does sugar do? Okay, obviously it makes cake sweet, but it also helps in making your cake nice and soft. That's because sugar is a substance that is hygroscopic. That's a fancy word that means that it absorbs moisture. So, when you're baking, your sugar absorbs moisture into the cake, helping to make it nice and soft. Sugar also helps to give your cake that lovely brown color. When sugar is heated, it undergoes various chemical reactions such as caramelization that give a nice flavor to your cake and also give your cakes a nice brown appearance. And sugar also helps to create structure with your cake. That's because sugar competes with the flour for moisture. So rather than the flour taking up all the moisture, some of that moisture is locked into the sugar, so you form less gluten bonds. Now remember earlier I said gluten bonds is important for the structure of your cake, but you actually do not want too many gluten bonds. Too many gluten bonds formation actually makes a tough cake. So the addition of sugar in your cake mixture actually creates that fine balance between having enough gluten bonds being formed with the flour versus too many gluten bonds. So you can see that actually sugar is quite a multitasking cake ingredient. And this is a common question I see on social media. I don't really fancy having too much sugar? Can I reduce the amount of sugar in the cake to make it healthier? Well, you could, but the first thing I will say is cakes are sweet. They contain a lot of fat and sugar and all that. They are not the most healthy food out there. And I think you'll just have to accept that. It's perhaps better to make it is perhaps better to make a nice cake which you eat occasionally so that you don't overindulge versus trying to cut corners, reducing the sugar content, and then you have a cake that doesn't work quite right. So, to answer the question, can you reduce the sugar? Yes, slightly. But if you take out too much sugar, you're going to end up with a cake that doesn't have the right structure and doesn't taste nice. That's pretty much a waste of all your cake ingredients and all your time. Apart from the regular granulated white sugar, there are actually different types of sugar that are used in baking. I've got some of them here. Now, this giant bag is your granulated white sugar. It's the same sugar that you use to put in your tea and your coffee. It's usually made from sugar cane. Now, there is brown sugar. Let's look at the brown sugar. And there's two types of brown sugar. You can have dark brown sugar and also light brown sugar. So these are also made from sugar cane or less commonly from sugar beets. The difference between the white sugar and brown sugar is the brown sugar is less refined. It's still got some of the substances called molasses that is originally in the sugar cane, and this gives it the brown color. The molasses also give a rich, complex flavor to your cake. So when you bake a cake using brown sugar, you'll taste the difference. It has a nutty, toffee-like, sweet taste. Absolutely gorgeous. And actually, to be honest, I quite really enjoy baking with brown sugar. Brown sugar does act a little bit different from white sugar. First of all, when you look at brown sugar, you'll see that it tends to clump together. That's because the molasses has more moisture. So when you use brown sugar to bake your cake, you'll find that the cakes are much more fluffier and softer compared to when you use white flour. Not white flour, white sugar. Can you substitute the two for the other? Yes, you can, but you can fully expect that the texture of your cake is going to be absolutely different. Your cake will still look nice, it will still taste nice, but the texture will be different if you swap brown sugar for white sugar. One tip to share with you, when you're using brown sugar, because it all comes together, I would recommend that you sieve it before you use, so that loosens up all the grains rather than having big clumps of undissolved sugar in your cake batter. There are other types of sugar or sweeteners that you can use in your baking. You can use other types of sugar. So here I have coconut sugar made from coconut. You can use this in place of brown sugar. Some recipes will use other sweeteners like honey or golden syrup. They're not interchangeable, but if your recipe calls for that, that's the role that those ingredients play in your cake. Another pro tip to give you, oh, I forgot about one thing that sugar does in cakes. You might have heard about the creaming method. Now, if you watch my videos, you would have seen it. I use that method a lot. So creaming is when you mix your sugar and your fat, which is usually butter, together, whip it up nicely to create a fluffy mixture. By doing that, you trap air into the mixture, and that actually helps to give your cake a nice rise. So that's another way that sugar helps create the structure because it helps give your cake a nice rise by using the creaming process. So you see, sugar is actually quite an ingredient. It does a lot more than just making your cake sweet. There are other sugars that we use in baking. Castor sugar. If you've looked at my recipe, you may see that I use it quite a lot. Castor sugar is just like white granulated sugar, but it has smaller sugar crystals. So this helps it dissolve quicker. I like to use it for some of my cake recipes, like my Victorian sponge cake. Another place where I prefer to use castor sugar is when I'm making meringue. In meringue, you've got to dissolve the sugar with your egg whites, and using castor sugar just speeds up this process. They are perhaps the one ingredients where it's interchangeable. If the recipe says use castor sugar, you can just swap like for like and use white sugar without stressing too much. Another sugar that we mustn't forget to talk about is powdered sugar, icing sugar. This is used to make buttercream, in particular American buttercream. American buttercream is powdered sugar and your butter. It's perhaps the easiest buttercream to make, and if you've never made it or you've made it and you struggled, don't struggle. I have a full tutorial. Actually, I did a live teaching on how to make amazing, delicious buttercream. So it's self-explanatory. It's like a free course on making American buttercream. So you should check it out. The link will be showing on the top of your screen, and I'll also put it in the description section as well. So I think I've covered sugar. And as you can see, sugar does a lot more than just make your cake sweet. Let's move on to the next ingredient. Now, this ingredient is perhaps the workhorse of baking. This ingredient is the OG of baking. Can you guess what ingredient that is? If you said eggs, you are correct. Eggs. Egg does a bit of everything in cakes. They bind ingredients together. They help with the raising effects of your cake. They add flavor. They add moisture. They do a lot of things in your cake. Eggs are made of two parts, the egg yolk and the egg white. Egg yolk is packed full of flavor. You put that in your cake, it impacts a lot of flavor to your cake. Egg whites contain a lot of proteins that act in many different ways. When you whip up egg white or a whole egg, if you whip it up very nicely, you incorporate a lot of air. So much so that you can whip up an egg or eggs really nicely, and that will have enough leavening agents to raise your whole cake. There are some cake recipes where they don't use self-raising flour, they don't use any other additional raising agent. Literally, it is the egg that causes that rise in your cakes. Amazing, isn't it? Bet you didn't know that eggs can do that. So you can actually make a cake just with eggs as the raising agent. Eggs help to bind your ingredients together. Eggs are what we call emulsifiers. Emulsifiers is something that allows two substances that don't normally mix to be able to mix together. And in your cake, two ingredients or two substances that normally don't mix together is your moisture, and so liquids like your milk, water, well, not water in your case, but water in your ingredients, and the fat. Normally, water and oils don't mix, but the addition of the eggs acts as an emulsifier to allow them to all mix together so that you create a nice batter that is well and thoroughly mixed. Here's some pro tips on how to get the best of your eggs. One, almost always, so let's say always, use room temperature eggs. Cold eggs don't mix properly, so don't use your eggs when they're cold. Make sure they are at room temperature. So, what happens if you have no eggs or you don't want to use eggs? Say you're making a cake for someone. who has allergies or can't have eggs. There are lots of other egg substitutes that you can use. I won't talk about them in detail because that's a topic on its own. But you can use things like applesauce. Do I have applesauce here? Yeah. Yes, applesauce and things like flax seeds, aquafab, chickpea water. There are lots of different other options, and these sort of do the same roles that egg does. Not as perfectly, but in a way that works. But yeah, that's eggs in a nutshell. On to the next ingredient. Okay, so next ingredient we're going to talk about are your fats, which are generally your butter and your oil. Fats bring the magic to your cake. They bring flavor to your cake. They bring moisture to your cake. They help to make your cakes tender. The butter versus oil debate is it's as old as time. Which is better? Should I use butter in my cakes or in my cake? You could use either. Now, the advantage of using butter over oil is flavor. There's just nothing quite like that delicious buttery flavor that you get when you use butter. And also, when you use butter, you can cream it with sugar to really get a cake that has a nice tender crumb structure. With oil, on the other hand, you don't get as much flavor with oil, but then there are other ways that you can remedy that in the cake recipe. Oil does make your cake nice and moist. Whichever that your recipe calls for, butter or oil really help your cake to be nice and soft and delicious. Pro tip, room temperature butter. If you use cold butter, it just wouldn't mix. Like it wouldn't mix properly. You'll see it in your batter. You'll see streaks of butter, or worse still, lumps of butter. It's very hard to mix up cold butter. So let your butter come to room temperature. If you've forgotten to take it out in enough time and you've got cold butter, what you can do is to slice it and dice it into tiny cubes and leave it out. So that way it comes to room temperature. Now we're going to talk about leavening agents, and the commonest leavening agents that we use for baking are your baking powder, no, your bicarbonate of soda, and your baking powder. These are the two commonest leavening agents. As I mentioned, actually, the third leavening agent that is commonly used is your eggs, as we covered that earlier. So, what's the difference between baking powder and bicarbonate of soda? Let me tell you so that you're never confused. So baking powder is what I like to think about. It's a complete leavening agent. It's got an acid and a base, so you can use it on its own. You don't need to have additional acid to get it to be activated. So when you use baking powder in your cake recipe, it doesn't have to have any acidic component. Baking powder contains bicarbonate of soda and other raising agents. Bicarbonate of soda, this requires an acid to get it to be activated. So you'll notice in recipes that use just bicarbonate of soda, it will have other acidic components like buttermilk or things like vinegar because it needs to be activated. Are they interchangeable? One word, no. No, no, no. Just don't do it. If your recipe asks you to put in 1 teaspoon of baking powder, use 1 teaspoon of baking powder. And when it asks you to put half a teaspoon of bicarbonate of soda, do that. And that's it. Leave it at that. Switching and messing around. No, we're not going to do that. They're not the same. They're not interchangeable. Liquids. There are lots of different liquids that you use for your cakes. Some of them are dairy-based products, so some cake recipes you use milk. Some recipes you use things like buttermilk, sour cream. Sometimes I use yogurt. These all add moisture to your cake. They also add flavor to your cake. Some of them also help to activate your ingredients. So we talked about how bicarbonate of soda needs an acid. Sometimes that acid is provided from things like your buttermilk. You need liquid in your cakes. Your flour needs to be activated by moisture, which comes from the liquid. You need to have the right balance of liquid. If you don't have enough, then your cake won't form the right structure and it will be tough and dense. If you have too much liquid, your cake, you just can't get structure, and then you end up with a puddle mess of cake that doesn't rise. So that's another ingredient where I would say measure properly and be strict with your quantities. Use what is stated in the recipe so that you get a cake that turns out beautifully. Next, we're going to talk about flavors and flavor enhancer. Let me go and get the salt. So, salt. This puzzled me. Why are we using salt in cakes? Salt is a flavor enhancer and it really, really helps in cake making. So if you have a recipe that calls for salt, don't skip it out. The salt really helps balance the flavor of your cake, enhances the other flavor to give you a nice tasting cake. Other flavors that you can use, now this list is endless. So let me just introduce you to the commonest one. So we all know about vanilla. This is perhaps the commonest type of flavoring used in baking. If you watch my videos, you will see that I drum on about using vanilla extract, which is extracted from vanilla beans, versus vanilla essence, which is actually artificial vanilla flavor, and just I don't think it tastes that nice. So stick with vanilla extract. You can use the vanilla pods itself. You can use vanilla bean paste. Other flavoring, what have I got here? This is coffee extract, almond extract. Other flavorings you can use cocoa powder, chocolate, fruit, nuts. The list is endless. Flavor is when you can go like herbs, things like lavender, tea, coffee, like we can go on and on and on and on. Flavors are what helps bring your cakes to life. Fruits, yeah, we can go on and on and on with flavoring. This brings your cakes to life, adds a bit of pizzazz. Yeah, so flavors. And there you have it, home bakers. We've done a detailed look at your baking ingredients. So now you understand the roles that they play in your baking. So you can go out there and make beautiful cakes. Which ingredients surprised you the most? I would like to know. Drop a comment in the comment section. And if you've got any questions, drop it in the comment section. Don't forget, if you've missed any of the earlier episodes, go and check it out. It's just as packed with information as this video. And don't forget to look at the link, click the link, and join me in my exciting baking project aimed at beginners. Till next time I see you, happy baking and see you next time.